Alrighty. Hey, everyone. Welcome to January's meeting of the Security Working Group. The agenda and attendance and notes, it's all in a Google Doc that should be editable by everyone, and that's in the link I just shared. So please feel free to add your name to the attendance list, and we'll get started. Does anyone want to bring anything up before we start in on the agenda we put together here? Alrighty. Well, so something we've been working on in the working group, mostly coordinated through Matrix, is the vulnerability disclosure policy that we're going to hand off to Open Robotics. Once we agree on a draft. Sid, you've been the one championing that effort. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So thanks for all the feedback, and I think we've got a handful of things still open issues. Just wanted to go over them, see if we could get your feel for where we stand on some of the things. Actually, let me share a link to the document so that if you want to, you can take a look at it. Oh, is that it, Kyle?
It's in the agenda. So visit the agenda, and then you'll see that there is a link.
Okay. All right, so just some comment and going through the comments, some of the big issues I think that we as a working group have to wrestle through. The first one is the scope. So what vulnerabilities actually do we want to cover? We'll talk about how in a second, but so very early on the policy. And this is, again, I'm just channeling what I see in a lot of standard policies, like what we want to solve here. Is what's the code that we actually want to take and own CVEs or vul reports on. And so initially I put in the entire everything under the GitHub that's kind of related to ROS, scope that back down. I think it makes sense to call it ROS core, ROS base, and desktop. And I also scoped it for both ROS 1 and ROS 2. So that's my just initial thoughts. Anybody have any reaction to that, whether that's a good scope, too big, too small?
Go ahead, Victor.
I just wanted to share maybe not my own words, but probably what was shared before. Which is maybe just reinforcing what people like Mikhail, which in my opinion is somewhat knowledgeable about ROS 1, and his suggestion essentially is to leave ROS 1 outside of the scope. So I would essentially just say I would support that. There are a number of reasons behind that. Biggest one I would say is that as of now, SROS, as far as I know, only is supported for Kinetic. Melodic has no SROS support. At least I wasn't able to launch it. I didn't spend lots of time, but probably we'll need to make some changes and review it. And as far as I know, it's not maintained anymore. So that's the biggest reason. The second one maybe, and that's interesting because I think that's a problem that, in an interesting manner, Canonical is solving, which is the fact that there doesn't seem to be people patching vulnerabilities, and from the last ROS Industrial Conference, we all got that Canonical committed to essentially maintain ROS 1 for a number of years, which I think is super exciting. And this is somehow connected also to the fact that without SROS, ROS 1 is just plenty, it's totally vulnerable. Like it just takes very little effort to overload the processor via a number of different flaws. We've seen implementation of ROSCOM with ROS TCP and ROS UDP. And I know Snaps and other Linux containerization technologies help in here. But yeah, my major concern is essentially that we should focus as a group. So I would very much encourage us to focus on ROS 2. Also, I think that there's been some great contributions from Kyle and some others on the ROS 2. The no IDL also looks super exciting. So I would say, and I would vote, let's go for ROS 2, guys.
That your concerns are exactly mine. one of the, and actually, Michael, I'm glad you're here. Your opinion will be really valuable as well. You're right. ROS 1 doesn't have a great security story, but it's also what everyone is using right now, right? I mean, if you look at the metrics, the percentage of people using ROS 2 is really, really tiny, and it's true. That's where security is obviously important to us, right? As we're actually making it, as it's supported. You're right. It's more actively maintained, but I'm concerned about coming out with a vulnerability disclosure policy that only covers things that people aren't actually using. The obvious question after that, though, is what happens when we get one for ROS 1? Well, there are numerous ways where it's insecure that we can't fix, right, by design. But maybe there are some that we can fix, you know. And it's hard to know without starting out with an open policy and ratcheting it back as we find things that just don't work.
Yeah, would support whatever we decide as a group, frankly speaking, and I think it's great. We are aiming for ROS 1 as well. I just am very concerned about how limited in terms of resources we are currently. But
yeah, no, we're not going to redesign anything, right? I mean,
yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, from the policy, you know, it really doesn't cost anything to allow people to report ROS 1 security issues. It doesn't mean that, you know, things have to actually happen. So it says we'll triage the vulnerability report, and it may just be that, hey, this is a known issue in ROS 1. The security story is not great here, and you know, you may want to find a workaround, but you know, we understand that vulnerability exists. I think it would make sense since it is like relatively cheap to just run an inbox, right?
Yeah.
It seems like it would be okay. I mean, we're not like offering bug bounties or anything for ROS 1 or really committing any resources to fixing problems. But like Kyle said, you know, if something big comes across, then it may be something worth, you know, actually looking into. But in general, I would think that the scope of this group is largely focused on ROS 2.
Yeah, agreed. And that was another thing that we, I think, probably want to discuss. There's well, actually, I'll come back to that. Let's continue on this. Is there, so your response was mine, Michael, where if we end up getting a report that is something that's by design or something that we can't feasibly fix in ROS 1 without breaking something, I felt my initial reaction was responding to them saying, we can't really fix this. Maybe you should consider using ROS 2, right? Or something is okay, but I'm curious if that has a bad PR aspect as well. And I was hoping maybe Sid might chime in. I mean, like if you report a vulnerability and you get back with, yep, that's a vulnerability, but we can't fix it. What does that look like?
So I think it should be rare that we have a vulnerability that we can't at least introduce some mitigation steps, right? And one of them is going to be, put the robot on its own separate network and firewall the heck out of that network. And I think that's going to end up being a standard solution for a lot of things. But, you know, if we find a pretty, like a straightforward buffer overflow or, you know, something that's actually easily contained, give it a CVE, patch it, and then advertise that we've done that. So even if it's in ROS 1, I think from, and Kyle, correct me if I'm speaking out of turn here, but from Canonical standpoint, we're committed to doing that, you know, as part of our support option, that if a researcher says, here's a true flaw and here's the, you know, maybe even here's the code that's related to that, we'll patch it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a case-by-case thing, but yeah.
So one question I'd ask is how deep in like the dependency stack are we going to try and be responsive to? So maybe in the case for ROS 1, when I was working on SROS 1, and I had the the TLS layer, the one aspect that was still quite exploitive is if you did get a certificate, of course you had access to the master slave API, but it was maybe even just before that with the XML RPC server that every particular node was running, and the parsing of the XML and the notorious vulnerabilities there are in remote execute code.
What are you talking about?
XML parser. So like there's dragons already sitting underneath us if we want to be responsible of that, and so I think that's a relatively like low hanging fruit, but we have a fork of a fork of a fork of the XML RPC parser that is sort of in our code tree. So that's something that's relatively low level, but we have, that's sort of on us in terms of the ROS community. And we go about fixing those kind of low level dependencies.
Well, so first of all, at least with the recent edit to the VDP, where we talked about ROS core, ROS space, and desktop variants, I suspect that the ROS1 SROS layer isn't going to be included in that. Is that specifically what you're referring to there?
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that people try and patch the SROS one. I think there's too many mitigation, or it'd be too difficult.
Yeah. So in that regard, I don't think that would be covered. But that's not to say that in SROS2 even, or I mean various parts of ROS parse XML or YAML or whatever, right? How far does that go down to whether we're patching YAML CPP all of a sudden? Is that what you're really asking?
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, how is that typically handled as far as like as a distro in Ubuntu, we get reports for projects that we don't maintain, right? But typically what we're doing to fix them is pulling the changes that have already been introduced upstream back into the ones that we have in Ubuntu. I don't think that we scale very well if all of a sudden we're trying to patch dependencies that we don't actually have maintenance of.
Yeah, so I would say, like, at least from like a ROS2 perspective, like in my mind, like it would stop at the like RMW fast RTPS layer, and if there was actually something wrong with fast RTPS, then that would be something that would be referred upstream.
Yeah, exactly. We can promise that we'll pass the issues on, right? We'll, if we've determined that it's in a layer that we don't have power over, then we can totally talk to those people.
The only kind of twist there is the stuff that we do vendor packages for. So like if it's TinyXML and we're vendoring TinyXML, then is that our responsibility as the ROS community? Is it a TinyXML responsibility? I mean, ultimately, if it's a security issue, it's upstream, right?
Right. I would say in that example, I'd say it's still TinyXML, but then we're also on the hook for making sure that we update our vendored code to include their fix once they have it.
Right.
And in this specific example, that's actually our fault because TinyXML has been unmaintained for 12 years, so no one should be using that.
I try to pick the best examples.
That was a pretty good one.
Yeah, so I guess, well, just to wrap up on to circle around on my comments from earlier on the scope, I'm not necessarily against having ROS1 in it, especially if we don't expect it to be like a huge amount of traffic. The one thing I was a bit concerned about is like it seemed to be under this working group that was ROS2 focused, and that a lot of what Open Robotics has been doing, but also other people, has been to not try to improve ROS1, but actually focus good practices on the ROS2 side and try to apply them to any code that comes from ROS1 to ROS2. And so that was one of the alternatives I was suggesting, that like we could focus that effort on ROS2. But on the other hand, any code we fix in ROS1 that we expect to be ported to ROS2, if it's already fixed, is just saving time for later. So it's also a good thing. And yeah, so it's just like that. That was my argument from yesterday that I didn't voice like out loud. But so I'm fine either way. I just see pros and cons in both sides, and as long as if it's not too much traffic. And apparently right now only Kyle and someone from Open Robotics is signing up for the work. So I mean,
well, yeah,
not-
so that's what I want to talk about next. That's a really good segue. As we're writing this, it's really easy to assume that the security working group is the one handling all of these, and that wasn't the way that at least we were recommending it be set up. Because that can be some really privileged information, and I want the membership of the working group to be a lot more open than that. If all of a sudden we're handling things that might eventually be embargoed, I feel like that should be a separate group, or maybe a subset of this. I don't know, but yeah. So what we recommended to Open Robotics was that it be, at least to start with, someone from Open Robotics, and the chair of the working group, which is Joe. Beyond that, it's kind of Open Robotics call. I wasn't going to make one recommendation one way or another. If they want to make that a new group or a subset of this one, I have no feelings about that. But does my concern about it being the working group as a whole make sense?
It totally makes sense to me, especially based on the mission statement as well, which is the working group is trying to develop best practices and features regarding security for ROS2.
Yeah.
People who want to join that working group may be a bit surprised when they actually come up with like, hey, you're actually a security patching team now. And
yeah, have fun. This one's yours.
So can the working group take on the responsibility? Should we take on the responsibility of doing the triage? I keep that separate from the actual fix, so that like when something comes in, are we authorized to say, hey, this is a really important thing, or this is something that's not ours?
So the triage is what I was talking about, right, Sid? So in Ubuntu, we don't, as a company, get vulnerability disclosures, right? That goes specifically to a specific team that has the responsibility of doing that, and they're trusted to look at that stuff and not break embargoes, right?
Yeah, I think if I understand it right, then the flow down is that we pull the CVEs, and when the CVEs are ranked high and critical, that's when we triage them to make sure that there's work going on. So I got that right?
Well, what about like our disclosure email address and that stuff, right?
Yeah, so two separate things. So
right.
If it's been disclosed and somebody's got a CVE and we're pulling the CVE down, but it's unpatched, right, then we'll get after that. And that's what the long-term support for, say something's been abandoned and the CVE's filed, that's a critical CVE, we'll get after that.
And the group that does that is tightly controlled, right?
Right, that's Joe's group.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
I think it should be tightly controlled here as well, and I don't want to tightly control the working group.
With the whole working group, yeah. Okay.
Does that make sense? Around the same page?
Yeah. I'm just trying to figure out again, I think like all of us, what is the working group's role then?
Right. Well, it's to drive security features in ROS2.
Mm.
And that brings us back to the scope, right? If it's not the working group, which again is focused on ROS2 that's doing this, then does it make more sense to have this be ROS1 as well as ROS2, or should we just start out with it being a smaller scope? And really, it ends up. I think it really ends up being Open Robotics' call.
I think it does. I think if the more and more it feels like we're drafting a document for robotics day-to-day practices.
And again, once we have this draft, and I go back to Brian, he may have totally different thoughts. I mean.
Yeah, and I'm trying to model it after some other similar communities, whether that's effective or not. There's not many that seem to be as active and complex and academic, I think, as ours. But okay.
For the record, I just wanted to state that I sort of agree with Mikhail's suggestion, like feeling of that, keeping the working group focused and ROS2 is probably the most effective use of our
Yeah, we're not debating that at all. Yeah, that's another one of the reasons I wanted to make sure this was outside of the working group.
And then having a portal where we're like either responsive or where we have to state that yes, we've received this ROS1 vulnerability, but no, we're not going to do anything about it. That might be like you had some hints that might be a bad.
You think that would look bad?
Yeah, that might look bad.
If you contrast that with how it would look as let me try this again. So your company, you are creating a robot using probably ROS1, right? Just looking at the percentage of people, and you find the vulnerability disclosure policy, on Open Robotics website someplace, and it includes only ROS2, not ROS1. Do you take ROS as seriously as you would if it also included ROS1? Like, there's a PR aspect here for that as well.
So I guess it would look bad, but it's more honest to maybe have the reporting part for book 2. So look bad, but be honest.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. I mean, I plus one what Mikhail and Rafin are saying here. Going ROS 2 and full ROS 2 and only ROS 2 is likely the best use of our time, frankly speaking. I mean, ROS 1 wasn't really originally created for industrial use cases. It was meant for something different. And what's available right now, which is a great piece of work for trying to secure it, is yet a patch on top. So I mean, we should really be clear and honest about that. And frankly speaking, even if we just pick ROS core or ROS base, however you want to call it, that's just a small piece. I mean, there's tons of packages out there which somehow someone will also need to look at, like MoveIt, for example. MoveIt is just huge. And either we go or we don't. Just ensuring we process somehow vulnerability reports on a ROSCOM, that's fine. But if there's something that breaks in I don't know, move base, for example, then we are as compromised. So also I think it's kind of like appropriate for us to push together with Open Robotics, citing with regard to the fact that, well, security efforts are being concentrated in ROS 2, let's all side together, and companies aiming for obtaining security, which is interconnected to safety and many other aspects, you should probably start looking at ROS 2. And by the way, the stats you mentioned, Kyle, I'd be happy to argue on that, because the ones I have and I'm currently looking at of companies making use of ROS for real industrial applications, many of them are considering now to move to ROS 2. I mean, there are some big names who already are using ROS 2, ClearPath and many others.
Yeah, no debate on that. I'm just talking about the ROS metrics, right? Like metrics.ros.org.
The one aspect that one aspect I think that would be maybe beneficial is the aspects of porting the packages. So like if we do get maybe like a remote code execution vulnerability, maybe like one of the higher level ROS1 packages that's being really straightforwardly ported to ROS 2, that might be like a nice helpful early canary in the coal mine so that when we do port it to ROS 2 we do it correct. So just one.
Yeah, I guess that's another issue, which is the straight, not very thoughtful port, which happens quite a bit. So yeah, that will help us. I wanted to make just one quick remark on the PR aspect, because I think it can really also go both ways. As a person trying to exploit some deployed ROS system, getting a weekly newsletter from Open Robotics with a list of exploits and attacks that I can use that won't be fixed is actually not a very good PR either, and would be very convenient for me as a hacker.
So interesting point.
So I guess like PR can go both ways, and I agree that it's more honest, at least, to like straightforward to say, hey, we're not going to try to do that in ROS 1 because like we know it was not like I mean, Rafin spent some time and did amazing work on like trying to push like ROS 1 forward, but like we kind of like gave up on it now and decided to like try to get that in ROS 2. And so I think, yeah, it would be more like straightforward to just say, hey, ROS 1 will not be fixed. There's always going to be a lot of exploits in there, and let's focus on ROS 2.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think you could probably caveat this document somehow in such a way that it's like, if you're a user that is interested in security and safety more than anything else, then we have to recommend that you use ROS 2.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And because of that, that's where we're focusing our resources and energy in terms of vulnerability and bug reports. That being said, people may still send ROS 1 stuff in, but I mean, I think it would be useful to at least say, like, if this is something that's critically important to you, you should probably be using ROS 2, because it's going to be an uphill battle the other way.
So are we in agreement then that we should scope this back to ROS 2 and add a sentence about why, essentially? Does that, I mean, again, this is all going to go to Brian, and then Brian might say, you know, I'd actually like to include ROS 1 in this, and then that's fine. But it's really the recommendation we make to the steering committee and Brian. What do you guys think?
Sounds good.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to scope it down.
Yep.
Okay, let's scope it down.
Okay, so I'll add something under the scope, just to talk about ROS 2. That's the opening sentence there, but then I'll also add the caveat in there right under the scope. It says if you really care about security, just skip ROS 1 and go to ROS 2. Is that kind of where we landed? Okay. Yep. So that was issue number 1. So there was one other, a lot of discussion about time frame until we fix things. I actually didn't put any time frames in there. There are some proposals, maybe 30 days, maybe 90 days. My reason for not putting that in there is because I don't want to levy requirements on ourselves. It usually seemed like the offensive guys, the guys that find the hacks, put the onus on the vendors. So that's why I didn't put it in here. I don't know if anybody has any preference, or if we want to settle on saying we'll commit to trying to fix something within 30 or 90 days, especially given that we're scoping it to ROS 2 now, or if we just want to stay mute on that.
Is there
Maybe.
an underlying minimum given on how we release packages? Like, if should we find and fix the bug, then it's going to be some X amount of constant overhead of getting that into a release.
Yeah, how often do the syncs happen?
So patch releases happen about on a 2-month, and then the syncs happen in the middle of that. So at least the Debian packages would be available probably within about 30 days, but a full like fat binary, if you were talking about all the platforms, would probably be about 60 days if it was like absolute worst case. And that's not to say that that couldn't be, pushed if necessary, but really there's kind of a fixed amount of time that you would want between patch releases just to save on churn.
Is it, Sid, I was taking notes as you were talking, so you may have said this, I'm sorry, but is there, I mean, I like the idea of giving clarity, to people reporting, knowing that this is generally what we like to see. Is there any downside to doing that? I mean, other than it kind of puts us on the hook,
So there's two sides. One of it is give us at least X amount of time to address this issue before you tell the public about it. So that's one side that I've seen. The other side that I've seen is we promise to fix this within at least X amount of time. So yeah, both of those seem to get kind of commingled. I don't see both of them saying, but and that's where most of the common ones, especially a lot of the active projects, seem to just not say anything. And it's kind of like, as you disclose it to us, you levy your requirements on us, we'll negotiate with you on that.
Okay.
So does that help?
Yeah, definitely. And you have a lot more experience in this area than I do, so I think that is.
That's all right. I just didn't want to paint us into a corner.
Yeah. Mikhail, Victor, Ruffin, I mean, please share your thoughts on that.
Well, I was probably the one that maybe insisted a bit on setting up a deadline. And this comes from research we've been doing internally at Alias with regard what's the usual, most efficient policy to try to ensure that mitigations happen. And our proposal of 90 days actually came inspired actually by Google Project Zero. Maybe some of you guys are aware. It's a pretty cool group of security researchers, and they're finding real good stuff. And essentially, actually recently they introduced some changes based on the input they got. So this can change over time. Just wanted to emphasize that. And one of the things that I also appreciated while reading through their posts is that they make exceptions. So provided that there is a responsive reaction from the people behind the patches, typically they facilitate a path that extends time, especially when the criticality of the flaw is not so relevant. But I mean, one of the things that I really got surprised at the very beginning is that sometimes they even push the deadlines shorter, meaning that if the criticality of the flaw is very relevant, like remote code execution, for example, exploiting an exposed buffer overflow remotely. I don't know. So in those cases, they push the deadline shorter. And that's maybe something to discuss as well in the future. But certainly I would encourage from my readings to set some sort of like deadline so that we give users that intuition that there's responsiveness behind the security approach and that we take it very seriously. But that's just my humble output out of the readings I've made so far, and what frankly seems like it's what's working best in other areas.
If they provide explicit guidance of say 90 days, but then they also negotiate with the reporters to potentially push it shorter or longer, well, what is the purpose of saying the 90?
Well, the purpose is essentially, so if there is a patch before 90 days, we coordinated the disclosure together. So if you patch it in 40 days, then in 40 days we release it publicly and we reward the researcher. If it takes 100 days, then if you haven't moved fast enough, we will disclose it after 90 days. So that's kind of like it is both, I think it was summarized before nicely. It's both pressure on the people working on mitigations, and at the same time, a reassurance for the people using the software that essentially they can expect patches within a specific time frame. So anything, go for it.
Just to clarify though, Google Project Zero is actually the mirror of what this group does. So Project Zero are the researchers that are finding bugs, and they're setting a limitation on what they will do, right? So, for example, they could work with ROS, and we would be then subject to their 90-day limitation. So I'm a little bit confused. The parallel between these two. I mean, we can set a limit of what we do, but whoever is disclosing a vulnerability to us, they might have their own schedule, for example, just like Google Project Zero has.
Right.
The idea
right, that's fair.
That we want the users at some point.
Ted, you're so quiet.
Sorry. Can you guys hear me better now?
Yeah, there you go.
We want the users at some point to know that there is an active security vulnerability that hasn't been triaged yet. So we need to, it's a responsible disclosure policy that, if we haven't reached it in this time, you'll know that, after 90 days or 120 days or whatever, the vulnerabilities will be open to the public and anyone can see them and understand how to take steps on their end to mitigate it, even if we haven't done it yet.
Well, it's not something that
but it's not us
right?
it's not us that are doing the disclosure. Oh, sorry, that's when I mean the working group that's doing the disclosure. It is the researcher that has found it that will do the disclosure. Is that not correct?
either side can. Like the idea behind the responsible disclosure policy is that, the two come to an agreement, but generally it's a case of like the minimum of the two. Like we want to give a promise on our part as the maintainers that within a certain amount of time, we will let users know of any vulnerability.
So it's two. I don't know where I'm getting all this echo, but so then two entities are doing the disclosure. Or how is that synchronized then?
Usually through some specific wording in the policy. Like, you mentioned Project Zero. Project Zero has a responsible disclosure policy, as does the 0 Day Initiative. Like, we should probably model our policies off of existing responsible disclosure policies. And responsible disclosure is generally on the maintainer's end, the promise that they make.
Right. The point that I'm making is like maybe we should model on vendors such as like Microsoft, Oracle, or VMware, or because we're on the receiving end of this.
That is true.
So the one challenge, and this may be a little bit tangential to this discussion, but the one challenge off of modeling off of closed source communities is that they can fix it behind closed doors. And that's where, again, maybe a bit of a different discussion, but how do we actually fix something given that as soon as you publish the fix, even if it hasn't propagated all the way through to the binaries, it's out there in Git.
Right. So, I mean, I guess we could, instead of say, Microsoft, or we can say the Linux kernel, or we can say, the BSD project, or things like that. I'm just, yeah. For example, I'm just saying like it should be modeled after the entity that's kind of on the receiving end of the vulnerability disclosure, not the initiating end.
So look at what like the Chromium project or OpenSSL has for a vulnerability policy.
Or Linux kernel, or GNOME or KDE or things like that.
Yeah, so like just looking, GitLab uses HackerOne, and basically if neither party objects, it automatically gets disclosed in 30 days. But either party, I guess, has the ability to, or I guess GitLab in that case would have the ability to override that deadline and let it go longer if they knew that it was going to take longer to fix. But it does seem like they have like a mandatory, it's going to get disclosed at a certain point kind of situation, but they call that out in their documentation. So probably something similar would be the recommendation here as well. So after submission and contact, 90 days or something like that, right?
A question in the opposite direction. If we do find and fix the bug before the deadline, at which point of the stage do you publicize it? Is it the point when the fix is merged into the source, or is it when the fixed source is released, or is it a certain grace period after the sync has been released that everyone has been updated? Even if any of those 3 points occurred before the so-called standard 30 days.
So I guess that depends a little bit. I guess it's just speaking from past experience with like kernel level disclosures. It could depend on the scale or kind of the severity of the vulnerability. But the ones that are embargoed usually are distributed to, I guess, a number of organizations. So if we had a case where a number of companies or organizations are using packaging ROS, then the way it's done is whoever is part of the embargo works on the code, and then when they have a timing window when they all release the fixes at the same time, and then whoever is not part of this embargo gets it later but whoever is part of it, gets it released as a this I guess coordinated process among cross organizations.
I would think in at least the scope of like how the ROS2 release process works, you'd want to wait for at least a sync, right? Just so that the patches would be propagated all the way out to the binaries.
Yeah.
Before making any sort of announcement. I guess that sync and or patch release, right? Depending on I guess the scope and severity.
I wouldn't wait long until after that to announce it either, so you can get it in something like Oval, or so you actually know that there was a problem and you're patched against it or not.
Right. Yeah. So as soon as general availability of not the source code, but actually like pushed upgrades, that's when you would do the disclosure, because otherwise that embargo doesn't really benefit you much if you have. I'm sorry, I'm getting so much echo. It's like confusing me. If you disclose it when just the sources are available, then you have this prolonged window before you have the binaries available, because the binaries usually will go through like a testing period, bake off, whatever, the SRU process and things like that. So there's definitely a delay there too. So I definitely think once the binaries are available, you would disclose the vulnerability, so people can just do an update.
So I just want to point out that I'm regretting this is a half-an-hour meeting. we are significantly over time. I think this is the longest agenda we've had. I mean, we can keep talking, but I do feel bad for keeping people significantly over what this meeting was supposed to be. Any thoughts?
I'm free.
Budgeted for an hour.
All right. Well, I mean, let's keep going then. So there are two aspects to a vulnerability disclosure process, right? And one of them is the public-facing document that we show we actually do handle vulnerabilities. We have a process internally for doing this, right? And here's how you report something. The other part of that, which is very important, but out of scope for what we're talking about right now, is what actually do we do once we receive something, right? I feel like we're kind of veering into this one, which is a discussion certainly to be had, but not the one that we're needing to have right now. Thoughts?
I guess that's true. Well, one thing that I liked about what has been brought up is like definitely we would be on the receiving end, which is something I did not really consider before. Like, I mean, I knew, but I didn't think about it explicitly. And maybe we're talking about Project Zero. Maybe there is like an alternate project of Google we can think of, which is actually OSS Fuzz, which is a project for testing and fuzz testing, a lot of open source projects that is hosted by Google, where people actually like opt in. So maintainers opt in, and the disclosure policy of this is the same as Project Zero, which means if something is found, only the maintainers would be aware of it, would be made aware of it. And then but Google has the time frame that is set, saying, okay, you can always discuss with them, but by default, it would be released and disclosed within N days, I think 90 or 30. And so I think we could think of that as an example where like it's a commitment of the ROS2 development organization to like try to find security issues and to try to mitigate them as soon as possible. And so then if some other people actually report, disclose some vulnerabilities with timeframes that don't agree with, like don't match with the one that is on the official document on the Open Robotics site, then it will be a discussion. But I think it still has a pretty good like public facing and PR aspect to like commit for at least the part that is in Open Robotics hands. Then definitely for what goes under, and that happened in the past, like finding massive vulnerabilities in some DDS implementations. This can, for some of them, take quite longer to actually like get released or get deployed, which is something that is not too much of an issue right now for ROS 2, but may end up being in the future as ROS 2 will be used on more and more projects. And so if you think of I don't know, a lunar rover or something, it may be a bit harder to patch on the fly at this thing. So that's something to keep in mind. But I still like the idea of having a time frame.
So I agree with you, Mikhail. And maybe, I guess on the flip side, whoever is reporting would use that as a base. This is, as a project, how much time we need to turn this and come to a point where we can release a binary that all users get updated. And hopefully then whoever is disclosing could use that as a guideline, or sort of like as a start in the negotiation process.
Which
Yeah,
I mean, that is really all that is, right? If they want to do a different timeline, then they they do end up driving it one way or the other. The question is, do we give them an initial thing to work with, which makes it clear, or do we want to just say, talk to us? Which
I think we should give them something just to set an expectation, perhaps, which is kind of more realistic expectation, because they might not know anything about ROS release process or anything like that, so maybe, setting an expectation ahead of time is actually helpful.
So what do you think?
I think a lot of folks might not be aware of that. They're external parties of ROS that might be informed them.
Yeah, because just us by itself, like I said, we're worst case 60 days. But if it was something even deeper, in like connects or something like that, that could potentially drag it out longer. So, I mean, I would think like 90 days would be a safe starting point,
Well, so Michael, to clarify, when you said 60 days, what I assumed was that's from when a fix has landed to when it has actually been released, right? That's ignoring the time to actually fix something.
Correct. That is like absolute worst case to get a new piece of code all the way through a patch release. Which
means with a 90-day policy, worst case, we get 30 days to actually triage and fix the thing.
Correct.
And I think if we're talking vulnerabilities that are serious, I'm pretty sure there is some convincing that can be done that we may like shorten the time and actually get a sync or a patch release from Open Robotics before then, if it's something very serious. So, I mean, like the case where you would wait 60 days, I would expect are like not the high priority ones.
Yeah, I think that's if that's kind of patch release steady state, right? But patch releases can slide earlier or later depending on how much content is available. So if there was like a big bug or a big show-stopping something, then it makes sense to get it into a patch release earlier rather than later. But if it's like cosmetic bug fixes, we can kind of wait for those to accumulate long enough in order to justify rolling up a patch release.
Yeah, so I think I'm after the discussions, I think I'm going back to where you started that, Kyle, which is like there's the internal and the external. For the guys externally, we're going to do our best bet, but internally, how long until we fix it? If it's 30 days, the interesting thing is then we're giving that to all of the ROS code maintainers as a requirement, right? So that's something that I think we would bring up to the TSC, because isn't that, if we say this code has to be fixed and it's, in some module somewhere that we don't maintain, then we're levying that requirement on the rest of the ROS community, right? So it feels like and that's why I sent that link to, I think that's how Apache does it, where they have to the public, this is what we commit to, and then to the committers, this is what you have to handle.
So maybe connected to that, there is a very interesting discussion ongoing right now in a new rep, which is discussing ROS 2 quality levels. I think it was initiated by William. And maybe some convincing argument would be that to reach certain quality level, maintainers should commit to patch security reports as indicated by the essentially security working group. that's maybe an interesting way to go.
Yeah, let me find that link.
Yeah, one of the concerns I have with that rep is that it's a self-claim thing. So basically anyone can say, oh, I say and I commit that my package is level 1, but if the maintainer of that project disappears and no one has access to it, I mean, like by default, it's self-claim. It's not like stamped by Open Robotics that this package is that quality level. And that's where there is another rep ongoing that could be useful, which is trying to define a set of commonly used high-quality ROS packages, which I think I put a link in the document, which is like ROS2 standard library or something like that, which could be another kind of scope. Even if right now I think it's way too early stage and very, very fuzzy on like what gets in and what doesn't. Like I still haven't been able to figure out what the criteria are. But that could be a way to also say, okay, this is what we consider ROS core, ROS main in Ubuntu terms, and then anything in universe would not get the same treatment.
So I know we're running long, and we haven't gotten through all of the issues. I think if I can, what I'll do is I'll take the document as we have it right now, move it to a new document, try to split it out to make it a little bit better for us to comment and collaborate on the document. The comments are just kind of getting long, and I don't want to lose the discussions we had. So I'll do something so that I can capture what we've talked about today, and then let the discussions continue online, because I don't think we're going to finish them during this call. I'm also going to, as we're going through the comments, there are 4 tasks that I'm going to add to the bottom of the document, so that if you could comment on whether or not this is something that needs to be done. They're kind of to-do items that are outside of the working group policy, outside of the disclosure policy, but that the working group might want to take on. So if you could start thinking about this, and again, I'll put them in the document, that we should teach or kind of give a template for vendors on how to create their own full disclosure stuff for their robots, that we should probably create a process for how to actually handle code updates that include sensitive vulnerabilities, like I mentioned about the separation of what Apache does. I think we have a task just to hand this off to Open Robotics and figure out what their take is on it. And maybe we need to do that before we kind of finish on our draft, because that might change significantly. And the last thing is that when we get this done, this needs to be whatever form it takes. It should be very easy to find, probably linked right off of the top of ROS.org. So those are kind of my takeaways, and I'll wrap that all up into another document and then share that, and we can start the comments over again if that works for everybody.
Regarding Victor's comment about the rep that William started, I just shared a link to it. He actually asked us to go through that the last TSC meeting, so definitely something worth looking at, and it is very relevant to what we're discussing here regarding, putting requirements on other members of the ROS community. And I can share that in Matrix as well, because Google Hangouts is very ephemeral. I say, why don't we kick the other agenda items to a combination of Matrix and at the next meeting, and maybe I will reschedule these to be an hour instead of 30 minutes.
One thing I don't know how people feel about it. As we start having like more various items on the plate, maybe would it make sense to actually meet every 2 weeks instead of every month now?
Yeah, it might. I mean, as we've had a pretty full agenda every time. How do people feel about that?
That'd be fine. Seems like we had a lot to talk about. It's kind of much for once a month.
Yep, +1.
All right, I'll pass it by Joe. He's on vacation this week, but I don't see a problem with that.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see what we could get out in Foxy. So it'd be nice to keep track on that.
So maybe one final comment before we close, Kyle. I mean, maybe I was a bit too harsh verbally on the criticisms about this merged or accepted commit right away, but I'd like to understand a bit more. What do you guys intend to mean by these veto capabilities? I frankly have to admit I got very scared about that.
Really nothing. It's just not divesting all power from the chair to everyone else. That's all. It's a new community. We're giving it a shot. We're not sure how it's going to work. Someone needs to retain the power to change things if necessary. That's really all it's about.
Okay, and to what extent are we as a group open to discuss these things? I mean, can we argue how we want to be organized? Because still, I feel many things are being defined about this working group. So it does feel to me a bit maybe too early to define such things. But shall we maybe, I don't know, take that back and discuss it in the future? Or how do you guys want to proceed with that? Because it does feel there are tons of things we still need to define, including the scope and actual packages we're going to support, and maybe getting back to your comment on one of the tickets I opened, what are we going to accept for newcomers and so on? So how are we going to proceed with the organization also? Do you guys have some insights, or shall we go the way it is right now and try to change it in the future if it doesn't work?
I think we've come up with an initial plan that I think we should try, but we should always be talking about it. I mean, this is why we have Matrix, and yeah, if you have concerns, bring them.
Yes, I guess to expand a bit on what Kyle was saying is that like the original like plan that was defined is that first the working group needs to like have a project, which like I mean implicitly we kind of agreed that like it should be SROS2 to start with.
Hey, actually, Michael.
Yeah, don't leave. I can see him disappear. Yeah, so I don't know how it's been going on your side, Kyle, to like move this forward. But yeah, like so just to finish what I was saying, Victor, I think like the idea would be that first it would be SROS2 and try to like bring like new contribution to SROS2, and that would be the base for people to like be part of like the working group on that community, and then as projects get added, like and the idea would be that people would like earn trust as they go. I don't know how like to define it, but like people would most likely, like most of them start as like the reviewer or like I don't remember what the names are, but like the first level, and like as soon as they contribute a bit, like can like start like reviewing and etc. and like kind of like climb the ladder.
It's all about trust and responsibility to the projects underneath the working group umbrella. We have none of those right now, but we're trying to move that direction. Michael, so eventually what we'll move to is accepting, well, we have the pull request like templates for it, but what we're hoping to move to is an application process to get new projects underneath the working group umbrella. But we were going to start by asking to see if we could get SROS2 under there, but I'm not quite sure who we need to talk to do that.
Yeah, I guess I don't quite understand the question. So is it moving SROS2 essentially out of the ROS2 org?
Into the ROS security org, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I can bring it up. Obviously, we just had our ROS meeting like 30 minutes ago, but I can bring it up at the ROS meeting next week. I mean, I think if that's what y'all intend to do and like commit to, you know, organizing or maintaining that organization and everything, I don't foresee that there would be any issues with that. I'm also the like point of contact, I guess, from the ROS2 team. So I am going to make every effort to be at these meetings from now on. So we should have somebody from the ROS team going to every working group meeting, I think is the intention at this point.
Awesome. Yeah, great.
But yeah, I'll put it on for next week.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, let me know.
I guess part of the questions, not necessarily only the like location of the repo itself. It would be more about like the actual like day-to-day maintenance of the repo. The idea would be to be able to have like a team on GitHub that can be tagged, which is like the security working group or like the maintainer of SROS2, and also the ability, like right now we're a bit in a limbo where like we don't really know who is reviewing, we don't really know who runs CI, and we don't really know who merges TRs on that repo. And
Right.
And so just like trying to clarify that as a whole and like try to like pass maintainership over to the working
we're
group.
saying we'll do that.
No. I mean, I think that's a good idea, and I think there's already kind of a like maybe a reasonable framework for that in the ROS tooling group as well, because they've kind of started doing that as well. So, like I said, I don't anticipate it being any sort of issue. I don't think anybody minds other folks trying to take on more in terms of ownership and maintainership.
I think the difficulty will be moving the release repository and all that CI stuff. Or do we even need to do that?
So,
I mean, changing GitHub paths is a little bit.
So, I mean, I think really the only thing is like if you were to move the SROS2 repo without moving the release repository, then you can potentially get some like permissions mismatches, right? In that people who have ROS security permissions may not have ROS security release permissions, or they would have to have ROS2 GBP organization permissions or whatever. But I can bring all that up at the meeting. I mean, it's not complex to move it. It just, has to be done if that's the direction you want to go.
Okay, very good. Yeah, if you could talk to the others about that, let me know what you think. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Well, we're now 30 minutes over. Does anyone have anything else you want to talk about, or shall we adjourn?
Good.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. Good talking to you all. I'll get back to you on the weekly or I guess bi-weekly meetings, and we'll see you soon.
Good. Thanks for organizing.
Bye,
Thank
all.
you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.